Welcome everyone to Coffee Talk. This is our peer donor webinar series. I'm excited to welcome you. My name is Helen Jenkins and I'm your Director of Development. I'm delighted to see you all here. Before we begin, I'd like to offer just a little virtual guidance for today's event. So Michelle, if you can go to the next slide, please. So please be sure to keep your camera off and mute yourself during the presentations. Do this by clicking the audio and video icons at the bottom left of your screen. And then just to note that for best viewing results during the presentations, select speaker view at the top of your screen or side of your screen if you're using a tablet. Once the presentations are over, you can select gallery view to see all of your fellow participants and join us in the conversation. After the presentations, you're also welcome to turn on your video. Next slide, please. After the presentations, we'll have a live Q&A. And so to ask your question, you can click raise hand, which is found under the react button that has a little heart on it at the bottom of the screen. I will then call on you and you can unmute yourself to ask your question directly to the staff. Please wait until you're called to unmute yourself and ask your questions. The other option is to type your question directly into the chat where I will read it out loud and it will be answered live. Thank you for joining us today. And now I invite Tim Whitehouse, our Executive Director, to say a few words. Tim?
It's wonderful to see a few familiar faces, and there are a few names that I don't know and people I haven't met. So I look forward to meeting you during the course of this discussion. I won't be long in this talk, but I did want to give a brief overview of our Coffee Talks and PEER as an organization and to introduce the wonderful moderator for today's events. So PEER's Coffee Talks are an opportunity for peer donors to meet our staff and discuss with them some of the environmental issues important to us as an organization and as individuals. We couldn't do what we do without your support. As I'm sure all of you know, PEER operates differently than any other environmental organization in the country. We represent environmental whistleblowers. We work with current and former government employees to protect the environment, the rule of law, and the rights of public employees. We engage in litigation and administrative processes to protect the environment. We partner with other groups, both big and small, to achieve our objectives. I could go on forever about what a great organization PEER is, but rather than do that, I want to turn it over to Mer Metzelfeld. Mer is truly an outstanding individual. She's PEER's institutional giving manager. She's been here about a year. She has a background in science and holds a BA in biology from Bard College and an MA in environmental studies from the University of North Carolina. Mer participates in annual citizen science counts of birds and butterflies and leads bird walks for several nonprofits in the DC area. Mer?
Thanks so much, Tim. And I am delighted to be participating in this coffee talk on one of my all-time favorite topics, birds and pollinators. So next slide, please. I just wanted to give an overview of the threats out there that are facing pollinators today. So what has been called the insect apocalypse is a major and continuing decline in insect populations worldwide, though most of the data is from the US and Europe, with pollinators being some of those most affected. It's conservatively estimated that the global insect population is declining by about 1 to 2% annually, meaning that these populations are being eradicated in the span of a human lifetime. There are many underlying causes, including overuse of pesticides and herbicides, which in turn eliminates pollinator food and degrades habitat, climate change, and light pollution. So 28% of North America's bumblebee species are threatened with extinction, and the endangered rusty-patched bumblebee has disappeared from 87% of its range over the past 20 years. New research has identified climate change as a cause of mortality for bumblebees and other bee species. Bumblebee nests function optimally at temperatures between 82.4 and 89.6 degrees Fahrenheit, and higher temperatures during spring may be lethal. Climate change also impacts pollinator behavior and habitat. Destruction of intact ecosystems, such as deforestation, contributes to climate change, illustrating the interconnectedness of these threats. Research has also shown that warmer winter temperatures are decreasing the overwinter survival of European honeybees, a key pollinator of many US crops. and increasing the likelihood of colony collapse. 19% of butterflies and moth species in the US are threatened with extinction. Insects comprise the base of the food chain for many animals, including birds, bats, and fish. Some research has linked insecticide use with declines in aerial insectivores such as barn swallows, martins, and swifts. Many of the same measures to help pollinators, stopping pesticide use, preserving and restoring native plants and ecosystems, will help insects in general. Today, we'll be discussing PEER's efforts to help pollinators, protect scientists, and reform pesticide regulations. We will hear presentations from PEER's General Counsel, Paula Dienerstein, about PEER's work with a whistleblower at the U.S. Department of Agriculture. And PEER's Senior Counsel, Peter Jenkins, will discuss PEER's work to stop the widespread use of neonicotinoid pesticides. Next slide, please. Paula has worked with PEER since 2006. She represents the organization in whistleblower, environmental, and Freedom of Information Act cases. Prior to joining PEER, she clerked for a federal district court judge in Washington, D.C., and then practiced with multiple small interest-oriented law firms. Her work included representation of states and advocacy groups in energy and environmental matters, including pesticides and organic food standards. She received her law degree from the George Washington University, and she has been on the board of directors of Beyond Pesticides since 2006. Peter has been an environmental, land use, and consumer attorney and advocate since 1983. He has held various roles in Washington, D.C., including of counsel at the Center for Food Safety, vice president for U.S. government policy at Conservation International, Director of International Conservation at Defenders of Wildlife, and staff attorney at the Center for Science in the Public Interest. Most of his work has been in aid of wildlife conservation in the fields of pesticides, genetically modified organisms, invasive species, wildlife disease prevention, international trade, land use conflicts, and other areas. Peter received his law degree from the University of Puget Sound, now Seattle University School of Law, and also has a master's degree in environmental studies from the Yale School of Forestry and Environmental Studies with a focus on conservation biology. Welcome, Peter and Paula. Next slide, please. So we wanted to start off with a question for Paula. Why are pollinators important to us?
Hi, so pollinators, most people think of managed bees like the European honeybee. But in fact, I don't know if you all can see me. In fact, pollinators include not only bees, but butterflies, flies, moths, bats, birds, and even some mammals. And what they do is they move pollen from one part of a plant, the male or female part, to the other, or to different plants to enable the plants to produce fruit, seeds, and new plants. About a third of our food production depends on pollinators. Honeybees alone pollinate 95 kinds of fruit. And there are crops with high dependence on pollinators, including almonds, apples, apricots, avocados, many kinds of fruit. And there are some crops that are entirely dependent on pollinators that wouldn't exist at all without them. And those include almonds and cacao. So we wouldn't have almonds or chocolate without pollinators. And we would have a lot less of all these other things. Pollination is valued by USDA as of 2013, probably more by now, at $20 to $30 billion a year. 75% of Earth's flowering plants are pollinated by insects and animals, and over 180,000 different plant species and more than 1,200 crops rely on pollinators. So next slide, please. So it's not only crops that depend on pollinators, but it's also forests and rangelands that benefit from pollination. Livestock food sources such as alfalfa and clover are pollinated, and so are ornamental plants and trees. By promoting growth and health of native plants, pollinators benefit natural ecosystems, and some plant species would eventually go extinct without pollinators. Thank you.
Thank you, Paula. I can see that pollinators are very important, especially for some of my favorite foods like chocolate. I can't imagine living without that. And also, I think that we don't think about this sometimes, but not only are our crops pollinated by pollinators, but ecosystems and native plants as well. So now we wanted to transition to a short presentation by Paula, and she's going to talk to us more about PEER-specific work on reforming pesticide use on wildlife refuges, and also our work with a whistleblower at the USDA. So go ahead, Paula. Next slide.
Okay, we get the next slide, please. So as many of you know, the way that PEER works is employees, public employees, will contact us and tell us about a problem they're seeing. And in this case, way back in 2009, a refuge biologist contacted us, and she had on a wildlife refuge in Delaware, a 150-acre demonstration plot of returning what had been cropland to native plants. And she'd been doing it for about 3 years. It was extremely successful. Native plants were coming back. It was a favorite spot for birders. And then suddenly, without warning, she was told that she should rip up this whole native plant area and plant crops, not to make way for crops, not only crops, but genetically modified crops. So we began a years-long series of cases that ultimately removed genetically modified crops and also neonicotinoid pesticides from national wildlife refuges nationwide. The policy was reversed during the Trump administration, but in practice, these refuges didn't go back to using these pesticides and GMO crops, which of course was a great benefit to pollinators. And PEER has continued to advocate on this subject. And recently, the Fish and Wildlife Service reaffirmed its commitment to biodiversity on refuges. So could we go to the next slide? So another way that we work, besides people just giving us tips about problems, and then we go forth and bring litigation, as we did with the refuges, is when we represent particular whistleblowers within an agency. And this one is Jonathan Lundgren, who is a research entomologist with the USDA Agricultural Research Service. He was a relatively young scientist with a very promising career, heading upwards, until his research started to threaten the industrial, agricultural, and chemical interests that are favored by USDA. For example, he found that research concerning the harm to bees and butterflies from the neonic seed treatments, and the successful use of beneficial insects and natural approaches instead of pesticides in farming. So when this research started coming out, John started getting harassed and subject to discipline. PEER represented him and enabled him to exit from USDA with his reputation intact. And he went and founded a regenerative agriculture research farm in South Dakota that's still working today. So not only did we help save his career, but we amplified his message. And the picture you're looking at is John with one of those hoods for beekeeping on, and this is a cover of the Washington Post weekly magazine. So the cover story for the magazine was about him, his travails at USDA, and his research concerning how agriculture could better benefit pollinators. And while we wouldn't expect that one whistleblower like this is going to change a huge agency like USDA from favoring industrial agriculture as it always has, one person alone can't do that. But when we bring cases like this and we succeed, it does give them pause on suppressing scientific research and harassing scientists. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Paula. I think those examples really illustrate PEER's unique approach to helping scientists, saving their reputations, and also working on really impactful reforms to pesticide use as on wildlife refuges in your first example, and then really just helping save a scientist from retribution and being able to go on to have an impactful career. So thank you so much. You did mention the neonicotinoid pesticides. And so although the mostly on wildlife refuges currently the neonics are not used, they are widely used. They are the most widely used pesticide on so many agricultural crops and also other plants that we'll talk about in more depth. And I'd like to turn it over now to Peter, who's going to talk more about PEER's work on neonicotinoid reform. Peter.
Okay, there we go. Thank you. Thank you, Mer. Thanks for, and Paula, thanks for setting it up. At PEER, we've had a really detailed focus on neonicotinoid insecticides, so I'm going to take a deeper dive into that. Before we do that, though, I would say just generally in terms of the environmental problems that are out there, of which there are, of course, many, pesticides represent one that's actually easiest for humans to get a handle on, compared to habitat degradation or global warming or pollution of various kinds. Those are often really tough to get regulated, but pesticides are all issued by, in this country, by EPA, and they could all be turned off tomorrow if it had the will to do so. So it's sort of a gratifying area to work in that you feel like there are opportunities to make a difference, and there have been many successful lawsuits over individual pesticides. But it's also very frustrating because the field is dominated by the political power of the ag and ag chem industry. So that's what we're up against. But neonicotinoids are sort of a new class of, newish class over the last 20 years of insecticides. And the three by far greatest use of neonics is with three compounds. One clothianidin, another's imidacloprid, and another is thiamethoxam. They're very effective killers of insects, and the way they do it is strange and unique in that they're mostly used by being coated onto plants, sometimes sprayed onto plants too, but mostly used by coating onto the seeds of the plants. And as the seed grows, the insecticide actually gets absorbed into the whole growing plant. So the plant becomes toxic to insects, which is a bit strange that we're eating crops that are basically so toxic that insects can't live on them. But you know, the studies seem to show that they're not toxic to people, although there's some doubt about that in some contexts. But they're very effective at killing insects, and those seed coatings are by far the largest insecticide use in the country, so that basically all the corn that you see as you're flying over the country or driving past cornfields or soybean fields, and many other crops as well, wheat and others, but particularly corn and soybeans together represent over 100 million acres in the country each year that's coated with these seeds. And the coating does not all stay on the seeds. It comes off during planting, it gets sloughed off, it runs off in storms, and it generally disperses off the seeds, but some stays on the seed. But it's when it comes off that it creates a very toxic compound around the soils, and it runs off into nearby waterways and therefore is damaging aquatic ecosystems. But the problem too is that these seeds are not treated as pesticides themselves because they're seeds, and EPA in its wisdom exempted them from being considered to be pesticides, and that exemption has caused a lot of problems I'll talk about in a bit. they're used prophylactically. They're cheap to get onto these seeds. And so almost all the seeds of corn and almost all of soybeans are coated with them. That is, they're not being used in response to any particular pest outbreak. They're just being used as insurance by the farmers. And that's the opposite of where this country has been trying to go in the last 40 or 50 years, which is towards what's called integrated pest management, or IPM, where insecticides are used only in response to an existing pest pressure, where there's scouting and people making sure they really need to use the insecticide. That's not the case with neonicotinoids. They're used no matter what the pest pressure. So it's the opposite of IPM. The result has been devastating to honeybees in farm country, and not only honeybees, but also all the other beneficial insects that are out there. And aquatic systems, as I mentioned, are getting contaminated. Many commercial beekeepers using European honeybees have been wiped out. Their hives just get repeatedly killed and destroyed. There've been large episodes of hives not being able to thrive, not being able to survive. And it's also resulted in mortality to birds, which Mur will talk about. And it's not all mortality. Some of it is sublethal effects, not actually killing the animals, but weakening them, making them more susceptible to other hazards. These are all documented in really well done scientific studies. But nevertheless, the neonics still are approved and used by the agency, used by farmers across the country. But the irony is that in Europe, they have been largely banned, and Paula is going to talk about that. Anyway, in working on this issue, one unique and interesting part of it is that PEER and the other groups that we collaborate with have been able to align with commercial beekeepers or the beekeeping industry. That's unusual for environmental groups to be able to align with industry groups in fighting some of the litigation battles and the advocacy battles over the neonics. Could I have the next slide, please? So what have we done? Well, since I've been at PEER since 2018, I should say before I came to PEER, I'd worked intensively for 5 years at the Center for Food Safety on neonic. But since coming to PEER, instead of trying to litigate individually over each new registration, we have focused on some broader reforms, tackle some of the broader issues. Some of that was supported by a Series Trust grant over about 4 years until the trust got spent down. But they gave us about $120,000, which helped support our work, such as they're shown on these photos here, organizing congressional briefings in the halls of Congress or in the meeting rooms of Congress, where we brought in experts to teach congressional staff or advise congressional staff about neonics and related issues. And in the lower left picture there is a very good congressman from Oregon, Earl Blumenauer, who was our lead speaker at the briefing. And also right next to him is Jonathan Lundgren, the scientist that Paula pointed out. We brought Jonathan in as an expert, and as well as a number of other experts too. And we did some lobby days around that, worked on legislation that was tackling neonics. And so it was a good way to network with a lot of other groups, such as the American Bird Conservancy, Center for Biological Diversity, and others. And we've held a number of meetings with OPP leadership, Office of Pesticide Program leadership, to try to advocate to them about these issues and get their attention, which I think has paid off a bit. In it, one way I can say that it's paid off is there have been 2 major public comment periods have resulted somewhat from advocacy that PEER has led, always in collaboration with others, but I think PEER can claim the bulk of the credit for 2 recent EPA public comment periods just over the last spring related to neonicotinoids. One related to a 2017 petition that I wrote when I was at the Center for Food Safety that EPA basically denied, but then did some follow-up rulemaking of it, and that's to close the loophole for coated seeds, for the neonic coated seeds, to bring them tightly under regulations so that the labels on the bags are enforceable, label language being absolutely critical in the pesticide world. But right now, the seeds are exempted from any enforceable directions and enforceable warnings. It's all just advisory, and it needs to be enforceable. So EPA has taken that issue up very slowly, but nevertheless did a big public comment period to take input on the idea of making it more feasible to enforce against misuse of these seeds. And the ways they can be misused is, for example, be planted in heavy winds when bees and other beneficial insects are nearby, and the wind carries the dust from the seeds and kills the beehives, which has happened frequently. But in the past, that has not been enforceable, so they can bring that under enforcement, and also many other ways they can preserve nearby waters and so on from excessive contamination. So that's one rulemaking process, and PEER, working with other groups, got thousands of public comments in support of that rulemaking. And the other one, even closer to my heart, is a petition that we wrote in 2023, co-sponsored by 65 NGOs, called the Efficacy Petition. And as I mentioned, the strange problem with these neonic-coated seeds is they're not needed in many cases. They're overused, they're used prophylactically. And so we are trying to, through this petition, get EPA to only approve them if it's shown that they're really beneficial in the given context that they're proposed for. That is, we're trying to get the EPA to force the industry to show that the costs of these using these things is exceeded by the benefits to farmers. And in many cases, it's not right now. They're just used haphazardly for no reason at all, really. So we want to get EPA to crack down on that through this efficacy petition. They're way overused, and the results are really damaging to the environment and to pollinators in particular. So again, that's another rulemaking process. We've got thousands of public comments in supporting that petition, and many, many groups signing on to support. So I'll wrap up by saying, though, that this is not an easy battle. I started out by saying that, you know, this pesticide policy is dominated by big ag, by the ag chem industry, the seed industry, and ag chem and the seed industry have now become combined because of the connection between seeds and chemistry and genetic engineering as well. The companies are often the same company that's selling the seeds, that's selling you the chemicals. So they have a lot of political power, and of course, big ag falls in step with those companies and those associations. So they've also fought hard against these rulemakings that I've just mentioned, and they put in lots of comments from their industry associations and members opposing what we're trying to do. So it's going to be on EPA. Hopefully we'll see some reforms come out in the next year or two or less, hopefully, to rein in neonicotinoids. That's kind of our number one priority, is to rein in their use. So I'll wrap it up with that and turn it back to you, Murr, if that's okay.
Thanks, Peter. It's very encouraging to hear the progress that PEER has made on this, and that you have made over these many years of effort, and especially that these two public comments have been mostly credited to PEER. And I was very excited myself to sign on to the sign-on petition this spring, because as an environmentalist and a bird lover, it's so frustrating to hear about this prophylactic use of these pesticides that are so harmful, devastating to the environment, and to feel like there's nothing to be done. But thank you for your efforts on this, Peter.
Sure.
And now we are going to have a short panel discussion. And we thought it would be interesting to talk briefly about how the US pesticide regulation or non-regulation compares to those regulations in Europe and Canada. So Paula, would you like to start us off?
Yeah, so the United States is not exactly the shining light on the hill in terms of pesticide regulation. our pesticide regulation is very weak. The industry dominates. And there are many pesticides, not just the neonics, but including the neonics, that are banned in other countries that are still being used in the United States. And Great Britain, for instance, restricted all outdoor uses of the 3 primary neonics that Peter talked about in 2018. But in Great Britain, there have been some exceptions where farmers will go to the government and say, you know, we're desperate, our crops are being ruined, we have to use them. And the government will give an exemption. Now, the European Union also banned these same 3 neonics since 2018 and did allow some exemptions. But then in 2023, last year, the European Court of Justice disallowed such exemptions and said that they couldn't do it anymore, that there had to be a complete ban. So there are still other neonics and other harmful pesticides that are being used in Europe. So it's certainly not perfect. However, they're way ahead of the United States in what they've done here. In this country, there's not much being done on a federal level in terms of restricting pesticides that harm bees. But there are some things being done on state and local levels, and I think Peter's going to talk about that.
Well, thanks, Paul. And first I'll mention in Canada is the best success story that we have in North America, but it's only in the province of Quebec, where Quebec really took this problem of prophylactic use and unnecessary use of neonics seriously, and they simply imposed a requirement that farmers, if they wanted to use neonics on their crops, they had to get a signed authorization or a signed recommendation from an agronomist, some local farm expert, saying that they were needed. And whereas before that requirement, something like 80 to 90% of the corn and soybeans was coated with neonic seeds, after they imposed that requirement in 2019, and it took a year or two to fully take effect, but after it fully took effect, the amount of corn and soybeans that was coated with neonics dropped dramatically down to less than 5%. I think it was the figures I saw were down to about 1%. In other words, only 1 to 5% of the farmers actually had some evidence that they actually needed to use these seeds. I mean, these coated seeds with these chemicals on them. So they had to use uncoated seeds. Well, what was the result? The result was not loss of crop production. Their yields didn't go down, just as in Europe, the yields have not gone down from imposing the ban on neonics in Europe or in Britain. And what they did find, though, was that not only were the crops still producing, but their waterways were being cleaned up. That is, there was much less contamination of the waters. And, you know, I can't testify that the birds and the bees and everything have come back to be healthier, but there is follow-up evidence from Canada that from Quebec that this can clean up waters. And then I want to talk about, Paul said the US doesn't really have any good national restrictions. That's true, but there are states that have taken action in response to these very concerns that we've talked about. And there's sort of the more progressive New England and West Coast states, and they're not able as states to really tackle the ag industry head on, but what they've done is restrict neonics in many other uses, such as ornamental plants, which we haven't even talked about, but they're used in large amounts on ornamental plants, on landscaping, and in landscaping uses. And what these states have done is restricted private landowners and people maintaining their yards across the whole state from using neonics, because again, those are huge areas of use, and they can be just as harmful to pollinators as the ag situation. So that started in Connecticut in 2016, and I'm happy to say my state of Maryland was also one of the states, and I'll just quickly run the list out to those who may be aware of that they are in a state like that, just so you know, or want to take some pride in the fact It's Connecticut, Maryland, Vermont, Maine, Massachusetts, New Jersey, New York, Rhode Island, then Colorado, and California, and very recently, the state of Washington. So 11 states have now taken action, not complete action, but some action to restrict neonics. So that's been a good thing. So turn it back to you, Murra, is it?
Great, thanks, Peter. It's great to hear that although there aren't uniform regulations and Great Britain is not fully implementing a ban on neonicotinoids, there is a lot of encouraging evidence coming out of Canada and all these states taking action. And I just wanted to briefly talk about some data on North American birds. So Peter mentioned that the neonics they can be either lethal or sublethal effects on birds. And so one of the reasons that Europe took action on pesticides was because of these precipitous declines that they were seeing in their bird populations, as well as beekeeper advocacy. And in the US, we haven't taken comparable action, although historical data shows dramatic declines. For example, a 2019 study analyzing citizen science data from the Audubon Christmas bird count, the North American Breeding Bird Survey, and other bird monitoring initiatives found that populations of North American birds have declined by 2.9 billion, or about 30% overall since 1970. And some of the most impacted species are pollinators themselves, such as the iconic Baltimore oriole, Maryland state bird, has declined 44% since 1970. And then the hardest hit group of birds is grassland birds, such as eastern meadowlark and the northern bobwhite quail, which have suffered 54% losses. And so pesticides and industrial agricultural practices are certainly a large part of this decline. But there is also good news coming out of Europe. A recent analysis of wildlife comeback found that many bird and mammal species are increasing in abundance and distribution due to a wide range of conservation actions. And this is encouraging news as we advocate for more conservation measures in the US. So we'd like to end on a last question for our panelists is what can we all do to help pollinators? Paula, do you want to go first?
Sure. Let's see. Yeah, so we as individuals can do things on both a policy level and a personal level. On a policy level, we can advocate and educate to raise awareness about threats to pollinators and what can be done. One of the things that can be done, obviously, is these local pesticide bans and actions. Just where our PEER offices and several of us live in Montgomery County, there was this county council passed an ordinance that forbid all cosmetic use of pesticides on lawns a few years ago. So that was the kind of thing that in many states and localities and cities, people can advocate for organic management of lawns and also playing fields and parks in their own jurisdictions. We can promote organic agriculture and eat organic food. We can promote also the not using pesticides in other types of land management, not only agriculture, but forests, parks, and playing fields. In this country, lawns cover 40 million acres, or 2% of the land in the United States. And most of that, unfortunately, now is pretty much an ecological desert, but it also, being such a huge amount of land, presents a huge opportunity to help pollinators. And this is something that we can do as individuals. Even if you don't have a lawn, you might be able to plant some native flowering plants for pollinators on a balcony or something. If you do have a lawn, one of the big things you can do is reduce mowing. So that pollinator-friendly weeds like dandelions and clover can grow. There's a movement that started in Great Britain called No Mow May, where people Do not mow at all in May, since that's sort of the beginning of the season when the pollinators are looking for food and there's not much yet. So you want to leave as much as possible on your lawn. And then the rest of the season, you mow less, like maybe every 3 weeks instead of every week. And best of all is to replace lawns or parts of lawns with native flowering plants that bloom at different times and feed different types of pollinators throughout the spring, summer, and fall. And even in the fall and winter, there are things you can do. There's the movement to leave the leaves. Don't rake up all of your leaves, because some pollinators nest under those leaves, and leave other plant debris in the winter as food and shelter for those overwintering pollinators. Even dead tree limbs can be nests for pollinators. And of course, don't use pesticides and herbicides on your own property. So thank you for that.
Paula, that's a fantastic list of actions that we can take. And also I love the hearing that Montgomery County has instituted that ban on pesticides. And I'm looking forward to being an advocate in my community in Northern Virginia to try to make the same thing happen. Peter, do you want to add anything here? All right.
Well, I would just add that I was a bit skeptical about no mow May until I did it just this past May in my house in Bethesda, and my neighbors didn't think I was too weird, and it was very cool because throughout May, a big patch of clover was in our front yard, and insects were using it, and it was unnecessary to mow it. It just looked kind of cool anyway. So happy to say that no mow May really works.
Excellent. And it's very catchy also. I look forward to telling many people about No Mow May. And then just one other thing that I wanted to mention as an action that people can do, even if you're not a science, you're not an expert on bird or insect identification, there are lots of citizen science counts and groups that you can get involved with. And it's really impossible for enough scientists to be out there and gather the volume of data that is needed to look at big studies over large time frames to really gather all that evidence for the declines in populations that can lead to the conservation actions that we need. So I myself do citizen science counts, and I encourage you to as well. And we're going to share a list of different organizations and groups with citizen science counts and a lot of other resources after the event today. All right, and with that, I'd just like to remind everyone that you can put your questions in the chat, or you'll also have an opportunity to ask your question live. And I'd like to thank the panelists and turn it over to Helen Jenkins, who will be moderating the Q&A.
Yeah, thank you, Mer. So as Mer mentioned, we are going to start the Q&A. So I just invite all attendees at this time to select Gallery View found at the top of your screen or on the side of your screen if you're using a tablet, so you can see all of the fellow attendees. I also invite you now to turn on your video, stay on mute. And as a reminder, to ask your question, you can pop it into the chat where I'll read it out loud and answer it live, or you're also welcome to click Raise Hand found under the React button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. I'll then call on you to ask you to unmute, and you can ask your question directly to the staff. So let's go ahead and get started here. Again, feel free to join on video. I do have a question for the panelists here. Paula, this is a question for you. Someone asked, can I try to get my local jurisdiction, like a city or county, to ban neonics or other pesticides that harm pollinators? What's that local process like?
So it's a little bit complicated by the fact that under the federal pesticide law, all states can have stricter requirements than the federal requirements. However, a lot of states have passed laws that prevent their local jurisdictions from having stricter requirements. And in fact, there's only 7 states. One of them is Maryland, where we have the Montgomery County ban, that allow local jurisdictions to have stricter rules about pesticides than than the state or the federal. So that is definitely a problem. It's something that advocates have been trying to change for a long time. But what local jurisdictions can do is, because they own the property that is their own parks and schools and so forth, they can decide what to do on their own property. That's not the same as regulating pesticides generally. So if you're in one of those jurisdictions that has what they call preemption of local action, either you can try to work on the state level since the states aren't preempted, or you can try to get your local jurisdiction to at least start with its own property, its own parks and schools and so forth, to use organic land management and no pesticides.
Helpful suggestions. Thank you, Paula. John is reminding us to also use the highest settings on our lawnmowers, which also helps keep things a little more natural. Thank you, John. Another question here. This is for Peter. We've heard that honeybee numbers have gone up in recent years. Is that right? And if so, what does that mean about the threat of pesticides?
Well, good question. The numbers of honeybees across the country really started crashing when this fear of colony collapse was coined, and it was the beginning of when neonics were coming onto the market around 2008. Total bee numbers in the country went way down. Since then, numbers have increased, but it's not all good news, because what it is that beekeepers have suffered huge annual mortality, but they have to work so hard to do it. But they do split their hives and bring on new hive numbers, and so that's why the numbers look to be going up, because beekeepers have worked so hard to add more hives, and they're doing that in response somewhat to economics, which is that the costs of the fees for pollination, which is actually where a lot of beekeepers make most of their money, from pollinating crops, almonds, apples, oranges, you name it. The fees for that pollination have gone up so high that that beekeepers are just heavily motivated to do that. But it was the neonic introduction, and when they all went down, that really drove a lot of beekeepers out of business. And the ones still hanging in there are working terribly, terribly hard. And another sign that things are not all that great, even though total bee numbers have gone up, is that honey production has not gone up. Honey production overall in the country has gone down. There's huge parts of the country, the Midwest and Iowa, the Corn Belt, where you just can hardly produce any honey at all. There's so many pesticides around that beekeepers can't produce much to speak of. So honey production is down. So total bee numbers may be up, but it's because beekeepers have had to work so hard to split their hives and do all that work that the overall mortality is still really high.
Okay, thank you, Peter. It's important to know. Another question here. This one's for Paula. Can non-native or invasive flowering plants also support pollinators? What can you tell us about that, Paula?
Yeah, so sometimes they can. And sometimes, the rush to sort of kill off all the non-natives may be a little overdone, because sometimes non-natives move in because you have a highly disturbed landscape and ecosystem, and they're just sort of filling in a void. And those non-native species, if they're flowering, sometimes they can help pollinators and feed pollinators. However, it's always better to have the native plants, because those are the ones that these pollinators that are in your region evolved to live with, over many thousands of years, and are specially designed to have this relationship where they are helping each other, the plants and the pollinators. Pollinators are getting fed, the plants are getting pollinated. So it's always best to have, if you're going to plant something in your yard for pollinators, have it be a native plant for your area. There are lots of resources on the web to find out what are the best plants for your area. And, but meanwhile, the other flowering plants probably will do some good.
Thanks, Paula. It's a good point. I'm just going to remind everybody, feel free to ask your questions in the chat, or if you have a tip or trick for how to improve pollinators in your garden, we'd love to hear about it. And you're also welcome to raise your hand so I can call on you and you can ask your question directly to the presenters. Peter, we have another question for you. How many native bee species are there in North America, and how are they impacted by these neonics?
Well, I actually looked into that question in preparation for this session, and I had forgotten just how many species. There's almost 4,000 species of native bees, which is more than the number of more than the number of mammals and birds combined. And that's just a bees, the little ones. Then there's another several dozen, like 50 species of bumblebees, the bigger one. So there's a huge number of native bees. They're, of course, hugely varied, scattered all over the country, and they're really important pollinators too. Some of them are critical pollinators for native plants, but also for crops and ornamentals. They do a lot of pollinating. So we really need to keep those native bees alive. And the problem is that many of, with so many species and being, fairly obscure in many places, they're not well studied. So we don't have great data on a lot of those species, but we do on some. We know that several are endangered. Many are endangered. The estimates I've seen is up to a quarter of all bee species in the country may be endangered. And pesticides are a big factor in that. But neonics, we know, are very damaging to those native bees. We don't have as many studies on that question as we do on their impacts on European honeybees, for example.
Thank you, Peter. That's really helpful. I did have a question for Mur. Mur, I understand you do sort of weekly guided birding trips, and you're in Maryland. What type of relationship have you seen with the pollinators and the general bird population in your area? And really curious to know if the hummingbirds have really come out.
Yeah, so we just had the spring migration. I mean, it's still going on, but we had the bulk of it was in the early part of May, when the hummingbirds and other migratory species, a lot of warblers and insect-eating species pass through. And in terms of pollinators and plants and kind of these impacts on them, I'd say kind of the most noticeable thing that we see in this area is that the species diversity of birds, like hummingbirds, for example, I don't really see a lot of them around my community, but I live in an HOA that is very manicured, and they put insecticides on the lawn, pesticides on the lawns, and I think the trees may be spared, so I do see birds in the trees, but a lot of them are the backyard birds, like American robins and catbirds, that don't seem to be as impacted by a lot of the factors that we discussed. Unfortunately, some birds are more sensitive, and so it's kind of a pattern that we see, is that the species diversity overall can be impacted, but then certain species will be very abundant that are more adaptable.
Yeah, I think we're seeing that more and more with climate change too. Really starting to see who's able to adapt quickly and who isn't. We have time for one more question, so I encourage the audience to type your question into the chat or raise your hand so I can call on you. In the meantime, a question for either Peter or Tim, not sure who's best to answer. Can you speak to our current relationship with the beekeeping industry? Certainly, we don't collaborate with a lot of industry groups, but this seems to be a natural partner for PEER.
Peter.
Well, yeah, as I said, that's kind of how I got into and excited about working on neonics, was somewhat the chance to work with the beekeeping industry, and also I know, for example, our client Jonathan Lundgren, who Paula talked about, has worked closely with the beekeeping industry when he was USDA scientist. He was the chief bee scientist. So both Jonathan and I would go to some of these annual meetings with beekeepers and present on different aspects of these issues. So that's one example. This was years ago, but there's still good opportunities to work with the beekeeping industry on these advocacy campaigns. And we work especially with a group called the Pollinator Stewardship Council, which is sort of the more responsible, environmentally progressive beekeeping community. There are some huge bee industry associations that are a bit unwieldy to deal with, the American Beekeeping Federation and the National Association of Honey Producers. They're like big industry associations, a bit harder to deal with, but still rewarding if you can get on their agendas and get them to focus in. I have to say that US beekeepers have not historically, for a number of reasons, been as progressive as European beekeepers. One of the reasons that ban got established in Europe in 2018 was because European beekeepers get really organized and progressive in their campaigns, and they would put on their beekeeping suits and march down the middle of Paris, you know, saying our bees are all dying. We need these insecticides eliminated, and that things like that did happen in Italy also. Those are sort of the two lead countries where the beekeepers really got organized and said, we can't survive under these conditions. US beekeepers, tougher to get them to do that sort of thing, but in some instances they will.
Sounds like an area ripe for PEER to work with. We are nearing the top of the hour, so I'm going to hand it over to Tim Whitehouse for some closing remarks. Tim.
Yeah, thank you, Helen. I put something in the chat. I started leaving brush on different parts of my lawn, and I live in a fairly manicured neighborhood. My neighbors look at me like I'm strange, but I have seen snakes. I even saw a salamander. I haven't seen a salamander in 10 years. So if you have a big lawn, don't mow it, leave brush, enjoy nature that will spring up from that, including pollinators. So I want to thank everyone for attending this coffee talk, and especially you know, Peter and Paula and Mur for your expertise. We're very fortunate to have a staff with such passion and deep knowledge and supporters that help fund our work. Before I sign off, I did want to remind everyone there will be a recording of this. We will share it with PEER subscribers to our email list. And we also have a webinar coming up on June 10th that I'm inviting you to. It's on our website. Plastics Revealed, Health Risks, Environmental Impacts in the Path to Solutions. So we hope to see you there. And if you have any questions, just reach out to all of us. We'll be happy to answer them. Thank you very much. Bye.